The garden had always been more than soil and stone. Those who once tended it knew this. Though they rarely said it aloud, they understood that a place becomes sacred not by the mere act of planting, but through care, through the silent, daily gestures that no one sees, through the rhythm of work that transforms ground into something more than itself. And now, as the wall rose anew, enclosing the land where neglect had once taken root, it was impossible to stand in that space without feeling their presence. The caretakers were gone, yet their legacy lingered in ways the untrained eye might miss. In the stubborn green shoots that still broke through the hardened earth, in the faint geometry of paths, almost erased by time, and in the very air which seemed to remember the fragrance of the flowers they once coaxed to life. It was easy to imagine them here, moving quietly through the garden. They were not people who sought recognition. Caretakers rarely are. They worked at dawn when the world was still hushed, their boots damp with dew as they pruned roses or knelt to loosen the soil around fragile roots. Their hands bore the marks of their labor, calloused, cut, and stained with the stubborn memory of earth. They were guardians of things that could not defend themselves, delicate saplings, aging trees, and tender blooms that depended on their vigilance to survive each season. In their time, the garden was alive in a way it no longer was. It hummed with intention. The caretakers understood the needs of each plant as though they were reading from an unwritten book. They knew which vines craved sunlight and which preferred the sanctuary of shade. They knew when to water deeply and when to let the roots thirst just enough to grow strong. They read the language of leaves' yellowing edges. Curling tip sand responded with quiet precision. Theirs was a dialogue with nature, conducted not in words, but in acts of care, repeated endlessly until the garden learned to trust them. But caretakers do not last forever. That is the unspoken truth of their work. They tend to what will outlive them. The trees they planted may still stretch toward the sky, their branches bearing silent witness. But the hands that placed those saplings are long gone. Some of the caretakers likely aged in the stillness, their bodies no longer able to kneel in the soil they loved. Others may have been taken by circumstance, by war, by illness, by the quiet cruelties of time. And with their departure came an unraveling. The garden they tended so faithfully began to slip into neglect. Without their watchful eyes and steady hands, the balance they maintained collapsed. Weeds crept in where careful cultivation once ruled. The fountain dried. The soil, once turned and nourished, hardened into something that resisted new growth. Yet their legacy did not vanish. It lived in traces, embedded in the very bones of the place. Even as the garden fell into ruin, it bore the imprint of their care. The paths they carved were still faintly visible beneath the overgrowth, their lines like ghostly veins threading through the wildness. The trees they nurtured remained rooted, their trunks thicker, their canopies wider, as if they had grown themselves into monuments of gratitude. Even the flowers, or what remained of them, carried some whisper of those who had planted them. A stubborn rose bush still bloomed near the wall's edge, its blossoms fewer now but bright enough to catch the eye of anyone who passed. It was as if the garden, though wounded, refused to forget the hands that once shaped it. And perhaps that is what a caretaker's legacy truly is, the quiet defiance of forgetting. They do not etch their names into stone or leave behind great monuments to declare their existence. Instead, they build something that can speak for them long after they are gone. The caretaker's voices still echo in the rustle of leaves, in the curve of a bench placed beneath a tree for shade, and in the steady hum of life that persists despite everything. They taught the garden how to live, and even in their absence, it remembers. The new builders, those who now came to raise the wall again, did not know these caretakers. They could not picture their faces or recall their names. Yet as they worked, they felt the weight of their legacy. Every stone they placed was not only an act of rebuilding, but also an acknowledgement that this ground had been loved once and could be loved again. The rebuilding was not merely about restoring walls. It was about honoring those who had come before. And yet, the act of honoring raised questions. What does it mean to truly preserve a legacy? Is it to rebuild everything as it was, down to the last detail? To create a replica of what the caretakers once knew? Or is it to evolve? To shape the garden into something they never imagined, but that speaks to the needs of the present? Some argued for preservation, for bringing the garden back to its former state as closely as possible, as if resurrecting a memory. Others argued for transformation, for allowing the legacy of care to live on in new ways, unbound by the past. There was no easy answer. Perhaps there never is. But the garden itself seemed to offer guidance. In the corners where the caretaker's influence lingered strongest, where their work had been most deliberate, life continued to thrive. The wild growth there was not chaotic. It carried traces of old order. It was as if the garden had learned to care for itself, mimicking its old guardians as best it could. And in the parts where their touch had been lightest, the earth had surrendered entirely to wildness. In this way, the caretaker's legacy offered both a challenge and a truth. You cannot truly recreate what once was. You can only tend to what remains and help it grow into something new. To walk through the garden now is to walk among ghosts, not haunting, but guiding. You see the caretakers in every stone that still holds its place in the path, in the fruit trees that continue to bear despite neglect, and in the stubbornness of beauty refusing to die. You can almost feel them watching, not in judgment, but in quiet curiosity, wondering what will become of the place they once guarded so fiercely. Rebuilding here, then, is not just construction. It is communion. It is a conversation with the past. Every decision, what to keep, what to change, what to plant, is a negotiation between honoring their legacy and forging a new one. And those who now step into the role of caretakers, whether they realize it or not, inherit more than tools and soil. They inherit a philosophy, a way of seeing the world. They inherit the understanding that true care is not about ownership, but about stewardship, about tending something so that it might outlive you, so that others might one day walk where flowers once danced and feel even faintly that someone loved this place. In that way, caretakers are never truly gone. Their legacy is not only in the garden they leave behind, but also in the hands of those who take up their work. And as the wall rises again, enclosing the land where they once walked, there is a quiet hope that their legacy of devotion, of patience, of uncelebrated love will rise with it. Visitors who never returned. The phrase carries with it a quiet sting, the kind that comes from realizing the doors once open have been shut, that footsteps once so familiar to a place will never again cross its threshold. It evokes an image of people who came to rest, to celebrate, to mourn, to simply exist for a while, and then left, never to be seen again. Yet, though their bodies have gone, their presence lingers in the air, in the ground, in the structures they touched, in the conversations they left unfinished. There is no such thing as a place that has truly forgotten those who walked through it. Even when visitors do not return, their echoes remain. Who were these visitors? Were they travelers who stopped for a night in a village whose roads no longer led anywhere worth visiting? Were they friends or family who once promised to come back but were swallowed by time, by obligations, by their own lives that took them elsewhere? Were they strangers whose brief presence left an outsized mark on those who stayed behind? Whoever they were, they carried with them stories that brushed against the fabric of the village, adding a thread, a color, before disappearing into the vast tapestry of elsewhere. Their absence now feels louder than their presence ever did. For the villagers, these visitors are not just forgotten faces. They are remembered in fragments, a voice that once told a story over to a laugh, that rang through the marketplace, a small act of kindness that lingers in someone's memory, like the scent of a flower long picked. In the spaces where these visitors once stood, their absence feels alive. The bench where one of them sat now seems to empty. The inn that once welcomed travelers now gathers dust. The road leading out of the village, which once carried the promise of their return, now feels like a wound, a reminder of the way people can simply leave, leaving those who remain to hold their memory like a delicate fading photograph. But perhaps the most haunting thing about visitors who never return is the unanswered questions they leave behind. Why didn't they come back? Did they forget the place? Did they forget the people? Were they changed by their journeys so much that the village no longer held meaning for them? Or did they intend to return, only for life to make that impossible? These questions carry a quiet pain because they rarely find answers. The villagers can only speculate, creating narratives that soothe or wound them, depending on the day. Sometimes they tell themselves that the visitors stayed away because they found happiness elsewhere. Other times, they imagine tragedy, convincing themselves that fate itself conspired to keep them apart. Either way, the truth rarely surfaces. And yet, for all the uncertainty, there is a strange kind of intimacy in how the villagers hold onto these visitors in their memories. They might not know where they are now, but they keep their presence alive in stories. Do you remember the merchant who arrived with a blue silk? One might ask, or the teacher who read poetry to the children in the square. These small recollections keep the visitors tethered to the village, turning them from fleeting passers-by into permanent inhabitants of its collective memory. Even those who came for only a day become part of the village's story, stitched into its identity. There is a certain weight in being a place of passage. For some villages, this is their entire existence, a way station between here and there, a resting point for those en route to somewhere else. They host countless visitors, yet rarely see them twice. This rhythm can be exhausting, leaving behind a constant trail of goodbyes. Perhaps that is why the villagers whisper about those who never return, to make sense of the transients, to find meaning in the constant coming and going, to assert that their village, though small and often overlooked, was significant enough to be remembered. But the absence of these visitors is not only emotional, it is physical, too. You can feel it in the empty chairs at the cafe that once hummed with conversations, in the unused guest rooms, in the roads that no longer carry the sound of carts arriving. Absence reshapes a place. It hollows out its corners, creates gaps in its routines. The innkeeper cleans fewer rooms. The baker bakes fewer loaves. The children who once waited eagerly for travelers to share tales of distant lands grow up learning that most people leave and never look back. Slowly, the village adjusts to the emptiness until it becomes part of its character, a quiet, resigned kind of stillness that whispers of a time when it was full of life. And yet, the villagers still wait. That is perhaps the most human thing about them. They wait in small, almost invisible ways. By keeping the inn in working order even when no one books a room, by sweeping the square before dawn as though preparing for a market that may never happen, by leaving the gate to the village unlocked. They know, deep down, that the visitors are not coming back. But hope, like grief, has a stubborn rhythm. It lingers, refusing to be silenced by reason. Perhaps the most haunting truth is that some of these visitors probably intended to return. They might have made promises they believed they could keep. They might have longed for the village, remembered its food, its faces, its quiet streets. But life has a way of rerouting people, of drawing them into currents they cannot escape. And so they remain gone, physically, at least, even if a part of them still exists in the mortar of the walls, in the worn paths of the square, in the stories of the people who stayed. To speak of visitors who never returned is also to acknowledge the universal pain of being left behind. It is a feeling that transcends geography, that lives in every person who has ever watched someone walk away, without knowing if they will ever see them again. It is the ache of an unanswered letter, of a farewell that felt temporary but became final. It is the kind of loss that rarely gets closure, which is perhaps why it lingers so powerfully in the village's consciousness. And yet, there is a strange beauty in their lingering presence. Though they are gone, the visitors live on in the way the villagers recount their stories. They become almost mythical figures, their brief interactions magnified by time into legends. A traveling musician who played for an evening becomes the one who brought music to our square. A passing teacher becomes the one who taught our children to dream of more. The village, in keeping its memory alive, transforms the visitors into something larger than themselves. In doing so, it softens the sting of their absence, turning loss into legacy. Ultimately, Visitors who never returned are reminders of the impermanence of human connection and the ways we try to fight that impermanence. They teach us that even brief encounters can leave deep imprints, that the people we meet in passing may shape us in ways we do not realize until long after they are gone. They also remind us of our impermanence, that we, too, are often visitors in other people's lives, sometimes leaving without returning, sometimes being remembered more than we know. For the villagers, these visitors remain as much a part of the place as the roses that once bloomed behind the wall, or the mortar that holds the stones together. They are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their footsteps may have carried them far away, but their presence remains here, in the whispers of the elders, in the imaginations of the children, in the collective soul of the community that once welcomed them. And perhaps, in some quiet, stubborn way, the villagers still keep a place for them. A chair left open at the cafe, a bed turned down at the inn, a lantern lit in the square, as if to say, even if you never return, you are still part of us. Every story has more than one life. There is the life it lived when it happened, when its moments unfolded in real time, when its participants breathed and bled and felt its weight. And then there is the life it takes on in the telling. Oral history is where those lives meet. It is where memory transforms into language, where the raw material of experience becomes a story passed from one voice to another. It is imperfect, fragmentary, and alive. It is not carved in stone like an official record, nor trapped between the lines of an archive. It breathes, changes, and grows. To speak of an oral history is to speak of a living, evolving memory, one that refuses to be silenced by time, one that survives precisely because it is shared. The phrase an oral history conjures intimacy. It suggests a circle of listeners gathered around a teller, leaning in to catch every word. It suggests a voice carrying weight, not because it belongs to a famous historian or an authority, but because it belongs to someone who was there. Oral histories do not demand credentials. They demand presence. They carry the authority of those who bore witness, the farmers who saw the fields burn, the mothers who whispered their grief to their children, and the laborers whose hands built cities that history books rarely name. These are the stories that rarely make it into official accounts. They exist in kitchens and marketplaces, in lullabies and laments, and in the quiet confessions of the old to the young. To call this part 3 an oral history suggests that something has shifted in the narrative. The first parts may have been about seeing, about stones and silence, about wandering through the remnants of what once was. But now, in part 3, the story begins to speak, not in the voice of authority, but in the voice of memory. Perhaps a keeper, once silent, has opened their mouth. Perhaps a wanderer has found someone willing to tell them what happened in this place. Perhaps the dead, through their descendants, have found a way to keep their truth alive. Oral history, after all, is an act of reclamation. It is a way of saying, we were here, we mattered. This is what they will not write, so we will tell it ourselves. Oral history carries a tension between fact and feeling. It does not always conform to the rigid boundaries of verified truth. Memories bend, emotions color events, dates blur. But this does not make them false. It makes them human. Oral histories capture something that archives cannot, the texture of living. They preserve how it felt, the fear, the hope, the scent of the air on the day everything changed. They give us the tremor in a voice, the long pause before a painful admission, and the way a teller's eyes drift away as they recount what they wish they could forget. In doing so, they remind us that history is not just what happened. It is how it is remembered. There is power in this. In many cultures, oral histories are the only way communities have kept their past alive. When colonizers burned records, when governments erased archives, and when trauma silenced generations, the spoken word endured. Grandmothers taught songs that carried the names of the forgotten. Elders told stories that mapped the old borders, the old ways. Survivors whispered truths that the official narratives denied. Oral history has always been the refuge of the silenced, to quiet rebellion against the forces that would rather their voices be lost. But oral histories are not just about survival. They are also about connection. To listen to someone's story, really listen, is to step into their time, their body, their pain, and their joy. It collapses the distance between past and present, between teller and listener. You cannot remain untouched by an oral history. It does not wash over you like a textbook. It seeps in. It makes you a carrier. You walk away knowing that what you've heard now lives in you, waiting to be told again. And this is the beautiful paradox of oral history. It preserves by changing. Every retelling alters it slightly, a detail added here, an image softened there. But rather than diluting its truth, this evolution keeps it alive. A story that does not adapt dies. A story that breathes endures. The people who share these histories understand this instinctively. They are less concerned with perfect accuracy than with continuity. They know that a story can outlive its tellers if it finds a way to move. Yet oral history also carries responsibility. To hear one is to inherit a duty, to honor it, to protect it, to pass it on faithfully, not by freezing it in place, but by holding onto its heart. This is why the keepers of oral traditions are so revered. They are not simply storytellers. They are guardians of meaning. They decide what must be remembered, what must be told, and how to tell it so that it survives the journey across time. And so we return to the scene implied in this part of the narrative. Somewhere, a story is being told. Perhaps the wanderer we imagined earlier has found someone willing to share the truth of the cracks in the stone, the echo of laughter that lingers in the air. Perhaps the silence of the keeper has broken at last. Perhaps a descendant of those who once filled this place with life now speaks for them, giving shape to what was lost. This oral history is not neat. It may come in fragments. It may contradict itself, but it gives voice to what would otherwise remain voiceless. In the end, to call this an oral history is to recognize that some truths are too alive to be written once and left to gather dust. They must be spoken. They must be heard. They must live in the mouths of the living, echoing through time, reshaped by each generation that dares to carry them forward. And so we listen not just with our ears, but with the understanding that what we hear now belongs to us, too. It becomes part of our remembering. It becomes part of our keeping. And in that way, the story imperfect, fragile, but enduring lives on. At night, under the pale and indifferent glow of the moon, the wall became more than stone. It was no longer just an artifact of abandonment, merely a forgotten barrier. It transformed subtle, spectral into something that almost breathed. On certain nights, when the wind passed through its cracks and hollows just right, it sounded like music, like the faint hum of something once alive. If you stood still enough, you could imagine it, laughter spilling out from unseen corners, footsteps shuffling in rhythm, the ringing of cups lifted in celebration. The air around it held a kind of density, as though it remembered too much to ever feel truly empty. Once, this place had known joy. It was impossible not to feel it. The wall had framed more than silence. It had contained life. Imagine it. Strings of lanterns casting golden halos onto freshly cut stone, the hum of voices rising and falling in their gentle chorus music, Creole music swirling through the night as hands clap. Feet pounded the earth and dancers moved in circles that seemed to defy time. The wall had not been a witness then. It had been a participant, holding that energy within itself, absorbing the pulse of living beings who had built, loved, and celebrated beneath its watch. Those days were long gone, but the faint trace of them clung stubbornly, like smoke from an old fire that refused to disperse. These were the ghostly festivities, not literal apparitions, perhaps, but the presence of memory, a residue of what had been so potent it almost felt alive. It is easy to imagine sorrow lingering in ruins, but joy lingers differently. It is lighter, harder to catch, but no less real. It drapes itself over the stones like a forgotten melody, haunting not with fear, but with longing. It lingers because it was once so loud, so full, so impossibly human, that its echoes can't help but stay, and yet, no one came back to revive them. No lanterns were relit, no musicians returned. The space remained still, its purpose long stripped away. Its once living heart turned to shadow, but the wall of stone can remember seemed to hold onto the vibrations of that life, keeping it as best it could. Perhaps this was its final purpose, not to protect or divide, but to preserve, to guard the fragments of something that existed only in the in-between, where memory and imagination meet. There is a unique kind of grief in such places, a grief not for what was destroyed, but for what was abandoned. The festivities didn't end in fire or catastrophe. They ended in silence. They were simply left behind, like a table still set for guests who would never arrive. And the wall became the only thing left to keep the memory intact, not as it truly was, but as a faint impression, a shadow of laughter, a suggestion of music, a ripple of warmth against the cold stone of what remained. Perhaps that is why it still stands. Perhaps it cannot fall. While those ghostly festivities continue to hum in its bones, while those unseen dancers refuse to leave, or perhaps we only imagine this, because the alternative, that joy can truly disappear without a trace, is too hard to bear. Even after the wall had been forgotten, after the blueprints were lost and the hands that built it had turned to dust, there remained an echo. It was not the kind of echo one hears with the ears, but the kind that lingers in the marrow, an impression left behind by everything that had once happened within its shadow. Every wall, no matter how abandoned, carries its history in silence. Stones remember, even when people do not, and so the wall stood, outwardly empty, inwardly full, a hollow vessel that could not speak, but could not forget either. This echo was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there in the way the wind sounded different when it touched its surface, in the way footsteps seemed louder when passing by, as if the earth itself were amplifying the memory of those who once walked there. Some who came near swore they could feel it, not a ghost exactly, but a weight, an unspoken reminder that this was not simply rubble, not just stone. It was a place that had been lived in, fought for, and left behind. The echo was not a sound, it was a presence. Perhaps it was the echo of laughter, faint and distant, from the days when the wall was new, when people still believed in what they were building. Perhaps it was the echo of arguments, of commands barked, of plans laid and dreams sketched in the dirt. Or maybe it was the echo of silence itself, the deep, unbroken stillness that comes only after everything has ended. But whatever it was, it clung to the wall like ivy, growing invisible roots into every crack, feeding off the life that had once been there. It is a strange thing, this persistence of memory. We think of echoes as fleeting, a sound that fades quickly after it is made, but some echoes live on. Long after the source is gone, they become part of a place. They shape how it feels, how it is perceived, how it exists in the world. The wall no longer served its purpose, but the echo ensured it still meant something, even if the meaning could no longer be named. Those who passed by could sense it. They didn't have to know the history to feel the weight of it. Some felt awe, as though they were standing before something sacred. Others felt sorrow, the kind that comes from confronting something that has endured too long alone. A few felt nothing at all, because not everyone hears echoes. Sometimes, to notice them, one has to be carrying echoes of their own. The echo that stays is not loud. It does not demand attention. It lingers in the background, humming softly beneath the noise of the world. And maybe that is why it endures. Loud things die quickly. Quiet things seep in and stay. The wall no longer had a voice, but its echo did, whispering of a time when it was whole, when it belonged to something greater than itself. And so the wall stood, not alive, not dead, but resonant. An echo does not need an audience to exist. It just needs space. And in the stillness between the seasons, the echo stayed, refusing to be silenced even as everything else moved on. They said the garden had been restored, though anyone who walked through it could sense at once that this was only half the truth. The wall had been rebuilt. The pathways were cleared. The fountain, once a hollow basin choked with leaves, now stood upright, scrubbed clean, and refilled with water that caught the sun in a way meant to impress. But for all the neatness, for all the order that had been brought back to this space, It felt hollow. There was structure without spirit, a shape without a soul. This was restoration, carefully measured, deliberately executed. But it was not revival. It is tempting to believe these two words mean the same thing. After all, both suggest bringing something back. But there is a difference, subtle yet profound, between mending what is broken and returning life to what once lived. Restoration is architectural. It concerns itself with surfaces, with symmetry, with the appearance of wholeness. It asks, what was here? How do we put it back the way it looked? Revival is messier, riskier, and far more elusive. It does not only seek to rebuild the visible, it seeks to awaken the invisible. It asks, what was alive here? How do we make it live again? And as the builders laid their final stones, it was clear that they had answered only the first question. From a distance, the garden looked impeccable. The pots were straight and sharp-edged, their gravel freshly laid. The walls, once crumbling into the soil, stood firm and newly moored. Their surfaces smooth and pale in the afternoon light. Benches had been installed at intervals, their wood polished and smelling faintly of varnish. Even the fountain seemed reborn, its water dancing upward in careful arcs, as if performing for those who came to witness the garden's supposed return. But step closer, and the illusion cracked. There was no hum of bees here, no fragrance of blossoms drifting in the air. The beds, though weeded, remained mostly bare, the few plants that had been placed seeming more decorative than alive, as if chosen for their ability to withstand neglect rather than their capacity to thrive. It was the kind of restoration that museums often attempt with ancient artifacts, preserving what once was, but encasing it in lifelessness, a shell of a thing, perfectly maintained and utterly inert. The caretakers of old, were they able to return, would not have recognized this place as their own. They had known a garden as a living conversation, a dialogue between human intention and the unpredictable will of nature. This new garden, in contrast, was a monologue. Every blade of grass, every stone, seemed placed to assert control rather than foster growth. The people who ordered this restoration likely thought they were honoring history. They must have believed that making the garden look like it used to was enough to bring it back. Perhaps they even imagined the caretakers, those patient guardians of soil and seed, looking down in gratitude as the garden was remade in their image. But they misunderstood. What those caretakers had built was never about mere appearance. It had been an act of devotion, day after day, season after season. It had been hand-stained with earth and knees pressed into the ground, watching and listening for the quiet signals of life. It had been the willingness to let nature teach them, to accept that they were stewards, not sculptors. Restoration without revival does not understand this. It is not patient. It does not kneel. It builds quickly, decisively, and with a checklist. It trades humility for efficiency. It does not wait for seeds to sprout in their own time. It buys full-grown plants, chosen for their immediate impact, placed for their visual appeal, and left to survive or wither as they will. It does not tend. It installs. And so the garden stands, complete but empty. People come to visit, admiring the craftsmanship of the rebuilt wall, taking photographs by the fountain, remarking on how lovely it is that such a historic space has been preserved. But none stay long. They leave quickly, unsettled by something they cannot name. Perhaps it is the silence, a silence different from the peaceful stillness of a living garden, more like the hush of a sealed tomb. Perhaps it is the sense that they are intruding, not on something alive, but on something staged. Whatever it is, they go, and the garden remains, waiting, because deep down, the soil remembers. It remembers the weight of the caretaker's steps, the warmth of their hands, the rhythm of their seasons. It remembers the flowers that once grew in profusion, the roots that drank deeply, the humming life that once filled this space. That memory lingers, deep and dormant, like seeds buried too long in the dark. The restoration has dressed the garden in finery, but it has not touched its heart. And perhaps that is the most haunting part, that life cannot be restored by design alone. You can rebuild walls, scrub fountains, and carve neat paths. You can make something look exactly as it once did. But without tending, real tending, the kind that demands humility and time, you cannot bring it back to life. You cannot force a garden to breathe. Revival requires risk. It means planting seeds without knowing which will sprout. It means allowing wildness to coexist with order. It means surrendering control to something greater than yourself, to the stubborn will of living things. It means watching, waiting, and accepting that beauty will come in its own time and on its terms. Perhaps that is why those who walk here now feel an ache they cannot name. They sense what is missing. They may not know the word for it, but they feel the absence of life. They are drawn to the idea of the garden, to the story of what it once was, but they leave unsatisfied because ideas cannot replace presence. And yet, there is hope in this stillness. The builders may have focused on structure, but they did not erase the soil's memory. Beneath the gravel and the freshly turned beds, there are seeds, literal and metaphorical, that could awaken. Revival is still possible, but it will require someone willing to go beyond restoration. Someone who will not only rebuild, but re-inhabit. Someone who will listen to the whispers of the earth and the ghosts of the caretakers, and understand that this garden is not meant to be a monument. It is meant to be alive. If such a person comes, a new caretaker, perhaps, or even a wanderer who falls in love with this forgotten ground, then the garden may yet revive. The walls will not just enclose space, they will protect life. The fountain will not just reflect the sun, it will quench the thirst of roots and birds alike. The pathways will not just guide feet, they will lead to places of growth and wonder. But for now, the garden waits in limbo, restored, but not revived, ordered, but not alive. A body without breath. The cost of preservation is rarely paid in coins alone. It is paid in time, in memory, in fragments of the soul that must be surrendered to keep something standing against the weight of years. When villagers speak of preserving their wall, they do not speak only of the labor of mixing mortar or replacing stones. They speak of the burden of holding on, of tethering themselves to something that resists the natural pull of decay. Preservation sounds noble, even romantic when spoken of from afar. But for those who live inside its daily practice, it can feel like a chain as much as a gift. The wall, with its weathered stones and stories embedded in the mortar, is more than a structure. It is an inheritance. It carries the memory of roses whose roots are now dust, of visitors who once promised to return, and of laughter that once rang freely in the square. To let it fall would mean letting those memories be swallowed by oblivion. But to keep it standing means more than tending to its cracks and worn edges. It means preserving a way of life, a narrative of what the village once was, even when the present no longer reflects the past. And therein lies the cost. Preservation requires that the living remain in conversation with the dead, that they make space for the voices of ancestors, traditions, and lost eras even when their own lives are pulling them forward. For some of the villagers, this work feels like an act of reverence. They gather with brushes and buckets, smoothing new mortar into old gaps, knowing that they are touching the same stones their great-grandparents once touched. They find dignity in this act, a sense of continuity that binds them to a story larger than themselves. For others, however, the labor feels heavier, an endless task with no visible reward, an attempt to freeze time that only underscores how much has changed. They whisper of how much is given up to keep the wall intact. Money that could have been spent on repairing their own home's hours. That could have been used planting new gardens. An energy that could have gone to building something new instead of endlessly propping up the old. This is the paradox of preservation. It saves and it burdens. It keeps beauty alive, but often at the cost of creating new beauty. It allows memory to endure, but sometimes traps communities inside the memory. Unable to imagine futures beyond the walls they protect, the villagers feel this paradox with every season. When a storm breaks a section of the wall, they rebuild. When wind erodes the mortar, they patch. Yet each repair reminds them not only of the wall's fragility, but of their own. They are temporary caretakers of something that will always outlast them if they succeed, or die with them if they fail. There is also the emotional cost. Preservation requires living with ghosts. Every stone, every crack, every layer of aged mortar calls forth memories of those who first built the wall, of those who tended the roses, of those who gathered in the square before everything became quiet. To preserve the wall is to keep those ghosts alive, to invite them into the present. It is not a quiet work. It stirs up grief. It reopens wounds that might otherwise have scabbed over. In preserving the wall, the villagers preserve their sorrow too. Some of the younger ones question whether this is worth it. They ask why they must pour themselves into protecting a wall when the roses it once sheltered are gone, when the visitors it welcomed no longer come, when the laughter that filled the square has become only an echo. Why not build something new? They murmur. Why not let the wall fall and plant fields where it stood? But their elders hush them. They know that letting the wall fall is not simply about losing stones. It is about losing a part of themselves, about severing a root that connects them to the soil of their history. Yet even the elders know that preservation comes at a cost. It consumes resources. It demands sacrifices. To keep the wall standing, some dreams must be delayed. Some needs must be unmet. The coffers that could support new ventures are spent instead on lime and stone. The hours that could be used to teach children trades are spent instead on teaching them how to care for what was left behind. Preservation insists on loyalty, even when the loyalty strains against the needs of the present. This is why some villagers carry a quiet resentment. They do not voice it loudly. To do so would feel like betrayal, but it lies in the heaviness of their steps as they gather tools and in the way their hands shake with fatigue at the end of the day. They resent the way the wall demands everything but gives little back. They resent how the past, so lovingly enshrined in its stones, seems to overshadow their own time, their own lives. They resent that preservation sometimes feels like an obligation instead of a choice. But perhaps this resentment is part of the cost itself, the emotional toll of living between reverence and weariness, between love for what was and frustration at what is. To preserve something is to wrestle constantly with its meaning. Why are we keeping this alive? Is it for them, the ones who came before? Is it for us? Or is it for some imagined future where this wall will stand as proof that we existed, that we cared enough to keep something from vanishing entirely? The cost of preservation is also invisibility. Those who maintain the wall often go unrecognized. Their labor is quiet, hidden in the seams of the mortar, and the repairs that blend so seamlessly into the old stone that no one notices them. People marvel at the wall as endurance, but rarely think of the hands that kept it from crumbling. Preservation is not glamorous work. It is not celebrated like creation. It is humble, anonymous, and often thankless sand, yet it is essential. Still, there is a strange dignity in this invisibility. Perhaps the wall's caretakers know they are part of a lineage of quiet keepers, people who, generation after generation, have chosen to hold back the tide of decay not for applause but for love. Love of place, love of memory, love of those who first built what they now sustain. And in this way, the cost becomes a kind of offering, a gift to the past and the future alike. But preservation does not only cost the living, it costs the preserved. The wall itself has been stripped of its original purpose. It no longer keeps out the wind. It no longer guards the roses. It now exists as a relic, preserved more for what it represents than for what it does. In saving it, the villagers have also frozen it in time, denying it the ability to evolve or find new meaning. It stands, yes, but as a monument to what is gone, rather than a participant in what still is. This is the quiet tragedy of preservation, and our attempt to keep things alive. We sometimes turn them into mausoleums. We encase them in reverence so thick that they become untouchable, unable to grow with us. The villagers feel this tension too. They do not speak of it openly, but they know it in their hearts. To preserve the wall is to preserve not only its form, but also its past, its stillness, and its inability to become something else. And yet, for all this, they keep at it. Because preservation, costly as it is, also anchors them. It gives them a story to live inside. It tells them that their lives are part of something longer and larger than themselves. It allows them to stand in a place where the past has not been entirely lost and say, "This mattered. This still matters." In a world that changes too quickly, that forgets too easily, the wall is a refusal to let memory be erased. Perhaps that is the ultimate cost and gift of preservation. It binds people to memory in a way that is both painful and beautiful. It demands sacrifices, but also gives meaning. It weighs them down, but also steadies them. It hurts, but it heals too. The villagers know this in their marrow, and so they gather, again and again, repairing, restoring, remembering paying the price for keeping their wall, and themselves, from disappearing into dust. Emptiness is supposed to be simple. It is supposed to be the absence of things, no objects, no people, no meaning. But when you stand in it, really stand in it, you find that emptiness is not simple at all. It moves, it presses. It mocks you. It is not the clean void we imagine, but a space vibrating with what should be there and isn't. This is where the absurdity lies. How can nothing feel so full? How can the absence of meaning itself become a kind of presence, one that provokes, unsettles, and even laughs at our attempts to make sense of it? When philosophers like Camus wrote of absurdity, they did not mean silliness. They meant the violent collision between our human hunger for meaning and the universe's indifferent silence. Emptiness is that silence, the unanswered question, the unfilled space, and yet, instead of lying there passively, it glares back at us as if daring us to keep asking, to keep expecting something more. The absurdity of emptiness is that it refuses to be nothing. We walk into a room stripped of furniture and swear we can still feel the weight of conversations, arguments, and laughter lingering in the air. We stare at an abandoned building and sense its ghosts. Even a barren landscape hums with echoes of what has passed through it. Emptiness teases us with traces. It says, "Look at me. I am void." But then it leaves fingerprints everywhere. Perhaps this is why emptiness drives people mad. A cluttered room, a crowded mind. These things comfort us because they give us something to push against. But emptiness offers nothing and everything at once. It confronts us with our own irrelevance while taunting us with the possibility that something, anything could fill it. It forces us to admit that we cannot stand nothingness. We will name the shapes and the shadows. We will invent meaning. We will populate the silence with our own noise. This is absurdity, our refusal to leave emptiness alone. There is also humor in it, though a bitter kind. Think of how carefully we try to fill the voids of our lives. We decorate empty walls, pile our calendars with tasks, and drown our loneliness in chatter or screens. And yet, emptiness remains. We cannot conquer it, we can only disguise it. It reappears in the quiet between words, in the moment after the music stops, and in the instant when we wake up at 3 a.m. and realize there is no sound in the house except our own breathing. The absurdity is that we treat emptiness like an enemy to be defeated, when perhaps it is just a mirror showing us how fragile our meanings are, how desperate we are for permanence in a world that promises none. Yet emptiness can be generative. Its absurdity exposes us, yes, but it also forces us to create. Artists know this well. A blank canvas is emptiness daring to be transformed. Writers face the absurd void of the page and fill it with stories, even in grief. The emptiness left by those we lose becomes the space where memory grows, where rituals of remembrance take root. The absurdity of emptiness is that it invites us to engage with nothing and, in doing so, make something. It is at once mocking and merciful, cruel and creative. To reclaim this absurdity, to live with it, we must stop expecting emptiness to behave like nothingness. We must accept that it carries its own strange vitality, that it hums with the residue of what has been lost and the potential of what might come. It is the theater where our longing and our mortality meet. It does not answer us, but it makes us ask better questions. And perhaps that is its ultimate gift. Emptiness will not comfort you. It will not give you the neat meaning you crave. but it will strip you bare. Remind you that your need for sense-making is both your greatest strength and your most profound absurdity. It will leave you standing in the middle of a room, staring into the void and laughing, perhaps bitterly, at the strange fullness of nothing at all. Some prisons hold people, and some prisons hold ideas. But the most insidious kind of prison is the one that holds nothing at all. It is a prison built for absence, walls raised around emptiness, gates locked to protect what isn't there. A prison for nothing. On the surface, this seems absurd. Why would anyone guard a void? Why enclose what has no shape, no weight, no life? But we do it all the time. We build structures, physical, emotional, psychological, not to protect what exists, but to preserve the outline of what once did. It is easier, sometimes, to keep nothingness behind bars than to face its unrestrained presence in the open air. This prison is not always made of stone. Often, it is constructed out of rituals, out of routines, out of the silent agreements we make with ourselves about what we can and cannot touch. It exists in the rooms we refuse to empty of their ghosts, and the stories we will not stop telling, because if we stop, then truly nothing remains. The absurdity is that the prison becomes sacred. It gives shape to the void, makes it feel tangible, even purposeful. We tell ourselves that by locking it away, we have contained it, but in truth, we are the ones contained. A prison for nothing can take many forms. It can be a house left untouched after its inhabitant is gone, each room a museum for their absence. It can be a relationship we cannot leave, not because it still exists in any living way, but because we have trapped ourselves inside its memory. It can be the unfinished project we refuse to throw away, believing that as long as it sits there, incomplete, we have not truly lost the ambition that once drove it. In each case, the prison is not keeping the nothingness out. It is keeping us inside, circling the perimeter of a past that can no longer become present. Why do we do this? Perhaps because nothingness in the open feels unbearable. It is easier to build walls around it, to define its boundaries, to visit it like one might visit a tomb. It becomes manageable. We can pretend that by giving it a space, we have given it meaning. And in a way, we have. A prison for nothing is a monument disguised as containment. It transforms emptiness into a relic, an object of devotion. But there is a darker side to this. Prisons, by nature, are not places of life. They are places of confinement, of stagnation. When we build a prison for nothing, we end up living in it ourselves. We walk its corridors, rehearse its old scripts, cling to the shape of what has vanished instead of stepping into the unknown. This is the tragedy of guarding nothing. It keeps us from recognizing the possibility of something else. And yet, perhaps there is a strange comfort in this imprisonment. It gives us an identity. It says, I am the keeper of this absence. I am the warden of what cannot return. It feels like purpose, even if the purpose is hollow. To dismantle the prison would mean to face the truth, that what we are guarding cannot be restored, that what is gone is truly gone. That is the unbearable freedom on the other side of the walls. But what happens if we leave? If we swing the gates open and let nothingness spill into the world? Perhaps then we discover that nothingness does not need to be caged, that it is not a monster, but a mirror, that its absurdity, its formlessness, is not an enemy, but an invitation. A prison for nothing can only ever be temporary. Sooner or later, we must choose, remain its keeper, or walk out into the unbounded silence and learn how to live with it. And maybe that is the paradox at the heart of it. We build these prisons to keep nothing in, but in doing so, we keep ourselves from everything else. When memory becomes ruin, something fundamental changes in the way we experience the past. At its best, memory is alive. It breathes. It reaches across time to hold hands with the present. It teaches, it comforts, and it evolves as we grow. But when memory becomes ruin, it loses its vitality. It no longer moves. It sits, frozen and unmoving, like a wall whose stones are no longer part of a home, but an abandoned shell. What was once living becomes inert. What once inspired becomes heavy. Memory, in this state, doesn't connect us to life, it entombs us in it. This is the difference between remembering and clinging. Healthy remembering allows the past to illuminate the present. It allows us to take what was meaningful and carry it forward, reshaping it for today. But when memory hardens into ruin, it becomes unapproachable. We dare not touch it. We leave it there, like a relic in a forgotten shrine. It becomes something we pass by, glance at, and maybe sigh over. But we do not know how to live with it anymore. We mistake the mere act of letting it remain for reverence, when in truth, it is neglect disguised as care. Think of the wall, that weathered structure the villagers still whisper about. Once, it held purpose. It kept out wind, sheltered roses, and defined the borders of a living space. It was not just stone. It was an active part of life. But as the roses turned to dust, as visitors stopped coming, as laughter faded into echoes, the wall's purpose fell away. And yet, it still stands. It has become a ruin. And in that transformation, it has taken on a different kind of memory, one that is heavy, stagnant, and unresolved. Why do we do this? Why do we let memories become ruins instead of either tending to them or letting them go? Perhaps because ruins make us feel safe. They allow us to keep the past without engaging with it. They let us say, look, we still remember, without having to do the painful work of truly remembering, which means feeling, confronting, questioning, and sometimes even changing what those memories mean. It's easier to let a wall crumble untouched than to rebuild it or repurpose it. It's easier to let a memory calcify than to wrestle with it. But there is a cost. When memory becomes ruin, it starts to suffocate the present. It looms over us, demanding acknowledgement, but giving no life. In return, the villagers feel this. They feel the wall pressing against them, not physically, but in the way it dominates their stories. It stands as a constant reminder of what has been lost, but offers no pathway for renewal. They visit it, they whisper about it, but they do not know what to do with it. And so, it becomes a monument not to history, but to forgetting how to live with history. This is not just about walls or villages. This is about us as individuals, as communities, and as entire cultures. When we hold onto memories without tending to them, without integrating them into our lives, they stop being guides and become anchors. They weigh us down. They keep us from moving forward. We see this in people who cannot release the pain of a betrayal, in families who cling to old grievances so tightly they forget how to love one another, and in societies that enshrine their past wounds without ever transforming them into lessons. Memory becomes ruin when it loses its living connection to who we are now. And yet, ruins are not entirely lifeless. There's a strange kind of beauty in them, isn't there? A dignity. Even as they crumble, they refuse to vanish. They hold space for stories that would otherwise be gone. They force us to look at what time does, not only to buildings, but also to people, to communities, and to relationships. That wall, now hollow and weathered, still speaks, but its voice is muted. It does not tell the full story anymore. It only hints. It provokes imagination, but cannot provide answers. The challenge, then, is this: how do we keep memory from becoming ruin? How do we tend to our walls, our stories, and our past in ways that keep them alive instead of letting them calcify? The villagers could choose to rebuild the wall, giving it a new purpose, perhaps to shelter something living again. Or they could carefully let it go, dismantling it with ritual and carrying its stones into new structures. Either choice would be an act of living remembrance. What they cannot do, at least not without cost, is leave it to stand as it is, half alive and half dead, a weight that demands their attention but does not enrich their lives. This is what we must do with our own inner ruins, too. We all have them. We all have memories that have hardened into walls, a conversation we replay but never resolve, a love we lost but never grieved fully, a season of life we cling to because we fear what comes next. These ruins take up space in our hearts. They block new growth. They keep us looking backward instead of living forward. And yet, they remain because dismantling them would hurt, because facing them would mean doing the painful, transformative work of remembering differently. But if we dare to approach them, to sit with them, to touch their stones, we can change their meaning. We can turn ruins into foundations. We can take what was heavy and use it to build something new. This is not the same as forgetting. It is remembering more deeply, not just what happened, but why it mattered and how it can shape who we are becoming. When memory becomes ruin, we are at a crossroads. We can leave it there, letting it erode into nothingness while it haunts us. Or we can engage with it, rebuild it, repurpose it, or even, when it is time, let it go. The villagers by their wall are not just standing before stones. They are standing before a choice to let the wall remain as a ruin or to make it part of life again. And maybe that is the point. Preservation without purpose is ruin. But memory, true memory, is never still. It moves. It breathes. It shapes and reshapes us. To keep memory alive, we must do more than let it stand. We must meet it. We must tend to it. We must decide what its story will be in the present, not just what it was in the past. The wall waits. It has waited for years. It will keep waiting for someone brave enough to see it not as a ruin, but as a beginning. The wall stands again, rebuilt stone by stone, but now it feels like more than a boundary. It has become a monument not only to what was lost, but to what endures. It rises in quiet defiance of the years that tried to erase it, its surface a mixture of old and new. Ancient stones still bearing the marks of weather and time, and fresh-cut blocks whose sharper edges betray their youth. At first glance, it might seem an ordinary wall, enclosing an ordinary piece of ground. But when you stand before it, you know better. It carries weight, not just the weight of its materials, but the burden of memory. Monuments rarely announce themselves. They do not need to. They simply exist, humming with significance that only those willing to pause can hear. This wall does the same. It does not tell a story outright, yet every stone seems to contain fragments of it, fragments of the garden it once sheltered, of the hands that built it, of the seasons that passed while it lay broken. It is both a relic and a declaration that what mattered here still matters, that some places refuse to be forgotten. Yet what does it mean for a wall to become a monument? It is no longer just a boundary marking space. Boundaries can fall, be replaced, or be forgotten altogether. A monument, however, transforms the ordinary into the symbolic. It says, remember this. Look here. Understand that something happened in this place that deserves to be honored. And that is what this wall now is, a silent teacher of history, a vessel for memory, an object that exists as much for those who will come as for those who were. But monuments are complicated. They do not simply preserve. They also interpret. They tell us how to see the past, what to value, and sometimes what to ignore. This wall, in its restoration, reflects choices, decisions made by those who rebuild it about which stories to honor and which to leave buried. Did they rebuild it exactly as it once stood, out of reverence for the caretakers who first raised it? Or did they alter its form, reshaping the past to suit present needs? And if they did, what was lost in the translation? The original wall, long ago, was practical as much as it was beautiful. It existed to enclose and to define the garden as a space apart from the wildness beyond. It provided safety for delicate plants, privacy for those who walked its paths, and a sense of belonging for the living things it held within. It was not just stone and mortar. It was intention solidified. The vision of caretakers who believed that gardens, like all fragile things, need protection to flourish. And when that wall crumbled, so did that vision, leaving the garden vulnerable to neglect and time. Now, as it stands rebuilt, its function has shifted. It no longer encloses a living, thriving garden. It frames absence. It commemorates what was, and perhaps that is why it feels so heavy. This wall no longer merely as it means. Every stone whispers of labor and loss, of what it took to bring it back, of what still has not returned. Its smooth rebuilt sections do not hide the scars of collapse. They highlight them, reminding anyone who runs their fingers along its length that this wall fell, and yet here it stands. To some, that resilience is inspiring. They see in this wall the triumph of memory over forgetting. They walk its perimeter slowly, tracing its lines, imagining the hands that placed each stone, the old caretakers, long gone, and the new builders, carrying forward work they did not begin. They think of the garden's past vibrancy and hope for its future. To them, this wall is proof that nothing beloved is ever entirely lost. But to others, the wall feels solemn, almost mournful. They see in its reconstruction not revival, but resignation, an acknowledgement that the garden itself could not be fully restored, so its boundary must stand in its place. Where flowers once bloomed, there is now an idea, carefully preserved in stone. They wonder whether this wall is less a promise of what will grow again and more an elegy for what will not. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps that is the paradox of monuments. They are at once hopeful and grieving. They keep the past alive even as they remind us that it is gone. They speak of continuity while confronting us with rupture. They celebrate survival, but never without an undercurrent of loss. The builders who raised this wall likely understood this duality, whether consciously or not. They did not simply set stones, they curated memory. They gathered remnants of the original wall worn, softened by decades of wind and rain, and paired them with new stones, sharper, paler, and untested. They left some gaps visible, not as flaws, but as reminders. They made deliberate choices about height, width, and placement, knowing that these choices would shape how future generations interpret the space within. In doing so, they turned the wall into something more than functional architecture. They turned it into a story. And yet, as with all monuments, interpretation remains open. One person may stand before this wall and see only what was lost. Another may see what can still be reclaimed. A third may walk away, uninterested in its history, noticing only the play of shadow and light across its surface. Monuments live in the eye of the beholder. Their meaning changes with each new visitor, each new era. This wall will mean one thing today, another in 10 years, and something else entirely a century. From now, though, it waits in quiet dignity. It watches as visitors come and go, some lingering, some barely glancing. It listens to their footsteps on the pathways and to their voices soft with reverence or indifference. It feels the seasons shift against its surface, rain darkening its stones, frost clinging to its edges, and ivy beginning as ivy always does to test its resolve. It endures, because that is what monuments do. But the wall is not only a witness to the past, it is also an invitation to the future. It asks, what will you do with the space? Will you leave it as it is, a preserved relic, untouched and unmoving? Will you tend the soil within, daring to bring the garden back to life? Or will you let it become something entirely new, unbound by what it once was? The wall does not answer. It only asks, and perhaps that is its truest purpose, to stand not just as a reminder of what was, but as a challenge to decide what comes next. Emptiness is often feared, as though it is a void that swallows meaning, as though it offers nothing but silence and grief. And yet, those who have lived long enough to sit with it, to walk through its halls and rest in its shadow, know that emptiness is a teacher, a stern one, but a teacher nonetheless. The villagers who stand by the wall know this better than most. They know what it is to look upon a place that once brimmed with life, with roses swaying against the stones, with footsteps of visitors who promised to return, with laughter that rang in the square and see only stillness. They know the ache of walking by that wall and feeling the press of what is missing, a weight heavier than the stones themselves. And yet, as they gather, they do not turn away. They come precisely because the emptiness calls them and demands that they listen to what it has to teach. At first, the lessons of emptiness come as a kind of quieting. The noise of expectation, of distraction, of busyness fades in its presence. There is nothing left to do but look, to really see what is there. The weathered stones, the cracks in the mortar, the dust that has replaced the roots of roses. Emptiness strips away illusions. It leaves no room for pretending. A garden without roses cannot be imagined as alive. A wall that keeps out people cannot be mistaken for one that keeps out wind. In this way, emptiness teaches the villagers to tell the truth about the wall, about themselves, about what has been lost. It also teaches them patience. Emptiness cannot be filled in a day. It does not yield to quick fixes or hurried repairs. You cannot plant roses in dry dust and expect them to bloom tomorrow. You cannot mend a community's spirit with one gathering or one whispered prayer. The villagers who continue to come to the wall do so not because they expect the emptiness to disappear, but because they have learned to endure it, to sit with it long enough to understand what it asks of them. They sweep the square, though no one dances there. They patch the wall, though it shelters nothing. They tend to a memory, knowing that sometimes the act of care itself is enough. Even if the thing being cared for never becomes what it once was. There is also humility in emptiness. It reminds the villagers of their own smallness. They are not masters of time, not conquerors of decay. They cannot bring back the roses, cannot force the visitors to return, and cannot make laughter bloom where grief is rooted itself deep. The wall's stillness tells them what they cannot control, but in acknowledging the smallness, they also discover a deeper strength, the quiet resilience of people who learn to stand, to tend, to keep vigil, even when they cannot change what has passed. For some, this lesson is bitter. They rage against it in their hearts. They ask why they should preserve what feels hollow, why they should continue to gather when emptiness greets them each time. They long for the days when the wall had purpose, when it held back the wind and guarded living roots instead of dust. They do not want lessons. They want life to be as it was. But even in this resistance, they are learning that grief, too, must be carried. That nostalgia cannot bring back what is gone. That longing is part of what it means to love something deeply enough to feel its loss. In time, some come to see that emptiness offers more than mourning. It makes space for reflection, for the reimagining of what could be. A wall without roses can still hold hope. A square without music can still invite gathering. Emptiness, in its vastness, becomes a kind of canvas blank, but waiting, asking what new stories will be written upon it. The villagers do not always know how to answer the call, but they know this. Standing before emptiness is the first step toward filling it with meaning again. In its own way, emptiness also binds them together. Shared loss has a strange way of creating community. The wall does not speak, yet it draws them in. They whisper their memories to each other, of the festivals that once spilled into the square, of the travelers who came with tales from faraway places, of the roses that perfumed the air in spring. They share the silence too, bearing its weight as one. In this way, emptiness teaches them solidarity, that grief is lighter when carried together, that silence is less suffocating when it is shared. Perhaps the most profound lesson of emptiness is that it forces people to decide what truly matters. When a place is full, when life hums with abundance, it is easy to ignore what is essential. But when it is stripped bare, what remains becomes clear. For the villagers, the wall is more than stones. It is their connection to those who came before, to the people who built it, who planted the roses, who gathered in the square. It is their inheritance, their story, their proof that they belong to something larger than themselves. The emptiness of the wall makes this truth inescapable. It reminds them that their lives are stitched into a much larger fabric of time. And so, they keep coming. They bring their children, pointing out where the roses once grew, telling them about the visitors who never return, about the days when the wall was not a barrier but a refuge. And teaching their children these stories, they begin to fill the emptiness with something new, not roses, not travelers, not laughter, but remembrance. They understand that emptiness can be transformed when it is met with intention. It does not have to remain a void. It can become a place where meaning is rebuilt. The wall, for all its quietness, becomes a teacher too. It tells them that things do not need to be full to have worth, that even in stillness, there is purpose. That memory itself can be a kind of feeling intangible, yes, but powerful. The villagers learn that to stand before emptiness and not turn away is an act of courage. To face what has been lost and still choose to tend to what remains is a kind of love that transcends circumstance. In the end, the lessons from emptiness are not about despair, but about resilience. They are about learning to live with what has been stripped away, while refusing to let that emptiness define the future. The villagers may never see the wall return to its former life. They may never see the roses bloom again or hear the voices of visitors returning. But they know this: emptiness does not have the final word. They do. And every time they gather, every time they repair the stones or whisper the old stories to their children, they are rewriting what emptiness means. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that emptiness, when faced with care and courage, can become a space of quiet creation, a place where grief and hope exist side by side. The villagers, though they may not name it in such lofty words, live this truth. They carry the lessons of emptiness in their calloused hands, in their whispered stories, and in the simple, enduring act of showing up before a wall that holds nothing but still manages to hold everything. To stand on the outside is to occupy a strange and often lonely position, neither fully belonging nor entirely detached. The outsider sees differently, precisely because they cannot blend into the scene. They are not softened by familiarity, not lulled into the rhythms that insiders take for granted. They watch, and in their watching, they understand things that those within rarely notice. Yet this perspective comes at a cost. To see from the outside is also to feel the sting of distance, to carry the weight of exclusion, and to know that one's place is never fully secure. An outsider's view is both sharper and lonelier. It cuts through the layers of assumption that make insiders blind to their own world. In a family, the outsider is the one who notices the silences between words, the tensions nobody names, and the rituals that feel more like cages than celebrations. In a community, the outsider is the one who feels the unspoken rules pressing in, whose body or accent or presence reminds everyone that belonging is conditional. In history, the outsider is often the only one who dares to write what others are too afraid to say. And so, while the outsider sees with clarity, they also live in the shadow of the clarity, aware that to know too much, to name too much, can make them dangerous. There is an absurdity in how insiders treat outsiders. They want them to assimilate, but also to remain at a safe distance. They are invited in, but only to a threshold. They are expected to contribute, but not to disrupt. This half-in, half-out existence can be maddening. It forces the outsider to learn the codes of the group, to mimic its language, and navigate its rituals, while never forgetting that they are always being watched for signs of otherness. It is a performance, one that outsiders often perfect in order to survive. But the performance comes at the expense of authenticity. How can you speak your truth when your very presence is an unwelcome truth in itself? Yet the outsider's view has its power, because they are not swallowed by the collective. They can name its hypocrisies. They can see the cracks in its myths, the fragility of its so-called certainties. This is why the voices of outsiders are often prophetic artists, writers, and rebels who reveal what others dare not face. They hold up a mirror to the inside, exposing its contradictions and asking, "Is this who you really are?" Of course, such revelations rarely make them welcome, but that is the burden of seeing from the edge. The outsider is also a witness. They record what insiders forget, what they dismiss as unremarkable. They understand how it feels to walk into a room and know they are being measured. They recognize the subtle shifts in tone that signal acceptance or rejection. They carry the memory of every door that was politely closed in their face, every time their presence was tolerated but never embraced. In this way, the outsider becomes a living archive of both what is said and what is left unsaid. But the outsider's view is not only about critique. It can also be about wonder. To enter a world that is not yours is to see its beauty with fresh eyes. Where insiders see routine, The outsider sees mystery, where insiders see inevitability. The outsider sees possibility. This dual vision of alienation and awe makes the outsider both dangerous and invaluable. They remind the inside that it is not the whole world, and perhaps that is why societies need their outsiders, even when they pretend otherwise. The outsider stretches the boundaries of belonging. They make the inside question its own walls. They prove that there are other ways to live, other ways to be, and sometimes, slowly, painfully, they transform the very space that once rejected them. Yet for the outsider, the question lingers, will they ever belong? Or is belonging itself a myth of comfort designed for those who have never had to stand at the threshold looking in? Perhaps the outsider's view is not meant to resolve this question. Perhaps it is meant to keep us unsettled, to remind us that every inside is also someone else's outside, that every community draws lines that someone must cross. To see as an outsider is to live in between in the discomfort, the danger, and the possibility of that space. It is to carry the gift of distance and the wound of exclusion. It is to know the world in a way that those safely inside never will.